So we've been recently seeing a bunch of rumors of Apple working on iPads with OLED displays, and based on some of the comments I've been seeing, people are totally misunderstanding the whole point of bringing OLED to the iPad. So before I get into what makes the most sense for Apple to do, I want to go through some of those OLED iPad leaks. Way back in November of last year, the Elec reported that Apple would release an OLED iPad Pro in late 2021, which seems way too soon after the Mini-LED model which just launched. So that's definitely not happening, and that's why a display analyst named Ross Young basically said nope to that rumor. And then a month later, Barclays claimed that an OLED iPad isn't likely until 2022 at the earliest, which makes much more sense. And then finally, in March, we got our first report from Digitimes, which specifically mentioned a 10.9-inch iPad being the first to get an OLED display in early 2022, which can only be the iPad Air, which recently got upgraded with a 10.9-inch display. Going even deeper, Digitimes mentioned that both OLED and Mini-LED will exist side by side, each targeting different customer groups, which basically shows that OLED is not going to be replacing Mini-LED like some people think it will. And then later that same month, Ming-Chi Kuo basically confirmed what Digitimes said, claiming that the iPad Air will get an OLED display in 2022, while Mini-LED will remain exclusive to the iPad Pro models. And the interesting piece of info that he added was that using OLED would not cost more than the current LCD display technology used in the iPad. But the most important tidbit here is that from Apple's perspective, Mini-LED will be exclusive to the high-end iPad Pro, while OLED will be used on the lower-end iPad models, which might not make sense to some people that believe OLED is superior to Mini-LED, like in this comment from a few months ago. So before I explain the differences between the two and why Mini-LED is actually superior, at least in Apple's eyes, let me finish off with the most recent leaks and rumors. Back in May, ET News reported that Apple will be using OLED displays in, quote, some iPad models starting next year, which is interesting because it points to other iPads like the iPad Mini and maybe even the budget iPad getting an OLED display. And then the Elec recently came back and agreed with that report, claiming that Apple will release an OLED iPad Air in 2022 and then release multiple OLED iPads in 2023. And then finally, the most recent rumor that came just a couple of days ago from display supply chain consultants is perhaps the most disappointing. They claim that the OLED iPad Air actually isn't coming until 2023, which is a pretty bold claim considering everyone else says it's coming in 2022. But if you think about it, they're actual display experts that follow the field very closely. And on top of that, they claim that Apple will be canceling the Touch Bar on MacBook Pros in the future, which makes sense because the Touch Bar is an OLED display that probably isn't showing up in the supply chain. And this claim perfectly matches up to rumors from both Ming-Chi Kuo and Mark Gurman, who said that the new MacBook Pros won't come with the Touch Bar. So that basically gives them extra credibility with their prediction of an OLED iPad Air only coming in 2023. But regardless of when we actually see it launch, let's now get into the controversial topic of why OLED would be going into the lower-end iPad instead of the higher-end iPad Pros. First off, the fact is that Apple chose Mini-LED instead of OLED for their highest-end 12.9-inch iPad Pro, which shows that Apple obviously thinks Mini-LED is better. So I did a little digging and I found a comment on MacRumors forums claiming that Sony has stopped making professional reference color grading monitors using OLED technology. This led me to avsforums.com, where somebody confirmed back in 2019 that Sony is shifting from OLED display tech over to a stacked dual-layer LCD design for professional reference displays, which is similar to the tech that Apple uses in their Pro Display XDR and the Mini-LED iPad Pro. And the very first of that kind was the Sony BVM HX310, which apparently was priced at 30,000 euros. And in HDTV Test's review of that display, he showed off that the contrast levels are almost as good as a reference OLED display, while not having any blooming issues whatsoever. He He even said he can't believe it's not OLED. But then he showed off the brightness differences using this iconic scene from The Matrix. And the new display absolutely destroyed the OLED display and basically any other OLED out there, because OLED is very limited in terms of brightness thanks to each pixel having to emit its own light. So if you're curious what this means for a tablet like the new Mini-LED iPad Pro, we actually compared it to Samsung's new Galaxy Tab S7 Plus, which comes with a 120Hz OLED display, and the results are shocking. Look at this massive difference in brightness in this HDR video, with the iPad Pro obviously on the left compared to the OLED display on the right. And this is weird because Samsung advertises this display as supporting HDR10+, which means it needs to hit 1000 nits of peak brightness. But the catch is that only a single pixel needs to hit 1000 nits to qualify. But in terms of full screen brightness, it can only hit 484 nits peak brightness compared to 1000 nits sustained full screen brightness on the Mini-LED iPad Pro. So just from watching this comparison, it's pretty obvious why Apple went with Mini-LED instead for the professionals who want to actually edit HDR video. But that's not the only reason, because OLED displays have a bunch of other issues as well. Check out all of these Reddit posts with users complaining about OLED display issues like having weird tint, screen uniformity issues, and flickering at low brightness. On top of that, OLED displays are known to give some users headaches because of the PWM tech required to make them work, which is something that Mini-LEDs don't suffer from at all. Going even further, OLED displays can suffer from burn-in like you can see on this Apple Watch, as well as this iPhone from an Apple store which has been left too long on the same home screen page. Once again, no issues with the Mini-LED display, so if Apple wants these iPad Pros to be used for long professional editing sessions, Mini-LED just makes much more sense since it has the least amount of drawbacks compared to OLED. So now, with all of that said and established, why would Apple be giving the iPad Air an OLED display instead of just going for the Mini-LED display? Well, because Apple obviously wants to keep their higher-end display exclusive to the iPad Pro to get people to spend more money. Like for example, next year's 11-inch iPad Pro is rumored to finally be getting the Mini-LED display as well as a 12.9-inch. But as far as the iPad Air, the reason it's getting OLED is because it desperately needs a boost, because Apple recently raised the price to $600, making it a bit of a worse value, especially since the M1 iPad Pro was recently released, packing in a ton of extra features compared to the Air. So in our recent buyer's guide video, we literally told people not to buy the iPad Air no matter what. Either spend $200 more on the M1 iPad Pro, or go for a less expensive model like the budget iPad, which is only $300 right now on Amazon. Better yet, just buy a refurbished 2018 iPad Pro with 256 gigs of storage for only $590, because that old model is still way better than the brand new iPad Air 4, which lacks various features like HDR video support, quad speakers, 120Hz refresh rate, and Face ID. So what I'm trying to say is that the iPad Air desperately needs something to make it special again, and that is why the iPad Air is getting OLED, along with reports that it won't really cost Apple any more money compared to regular LCD because it's going to use a rigid OLED design. And on top of that, it's going to be sticking to 60Hz refresh rate, which means it won't be suffering from many of those 120Hz OLED display issues that are currently plaguing the Galaxy Tab S7 Plus. But the ultimate end goal is micro LED, which Apple has been working on for many years now, and it is going to be the best of all worlds. So if you want to see a deep dive into how Apple is going to utilize micro LED technology in their products, make sure to click that circle above to subscribe for more videos like this one. Definitely check out one of those two right over there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.